The honourable member for Nanaimo, Cowichan and the Islands.
Mr. Speaker, the House has just given first reading to a bill designed to patriate the Canadian Constitution. And that ought to remind us that one of the reasons that motivated the Fathers of Confederation in bringing together the various provinces that now make up Canada was the fear that Canada would be overwhelmed and absorbed by the emerging giant to the south of us. And I submit, Mr. Speaker, that that's still one of our major concerns. Already, in the years that have transpired since 1867, we've gone a long way toward economic absorption, social assimilation, and political domination by the United States. The leader of the New Democratic Party, the member for Oshawa-Whitby, in the policy paper which he presented to the New Democratic Party Council and on which he has spoken in this House, called An Industrial Strategy for Canada, contended that the basis of economic growth in Canada depended upon retaining our valuable resources under Canadian ownership and control. And I may say, Mr. Speaker, that the Liberal Party in Canada has always paid lip service to the idea of maintaining economic independence for this country. Many of the members who have sat in the House in the Liberal ranks over the last 15 years have been members of the Committee for an Independent Canada. But the fact is that the record of their performance with respect to maintaining Canada as an independent economic entity has been a dismal one. The present government's been in office for 15 years. In 1963, there came into the House, headed by Walter Gordon and Donald MacDonald and what's the lady's name? Julia LaMarche. A group who came marching into the House of Commons to the tune of "O Canada, we stand on guard for thee." But in the years that followed, there was no change with respect to the steady encroachment upon our economic independence by great United States-controlled multinational corporations. Then, in the election campaign of 1974, the Prime Minister made a commitment to the people of this country. This is what he said: the Liberal Party of Canada sets as an objective that major new projects in the natural resource field should have at least 50% and preferably 60% Canadian equity ownership. Well, Mr. Speaker, when I asked the Prime Minister yesterday if that commitment still stood, the Prime Minister answered in the affirmative. Mr. Speaker, all the facts prove him to be wrong. And if he were onto his job, he would know that he was wrong. For instance, if he takes a look at the long list of oil and gas companies that have been taken over by foreign corporations since June 1974, he would realize that the 50 to 60% Canadian ownership clause has not been applied. If you'll take the trouble to look at the figures which are put out from the Corporations and Labor under the Corporations and Labor Returns Act, they will find that in the last year available, which is 1975, that of foreign companies in the petroleum and coal products production area, the foreign ownership is 95% in equity, 95% in sales, and 95% in profits. But I think probably the most damning indictment of the Prime Minister's commitment to maintain 50 to 60% Canadian ownership is to be found in this document, a copy of which I hold in my hand, which is over the signature of the Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce. And it is a review of the matter of Canadian ownership as compared to foreign ownership in this country. What does it show? It shows in the first place that there have been consistently takeovers by foreign corporations which did not involve 50% Canadian ownership. As a matter of fact, he goes on to say, and I quote, "In most instances so far, it is not proven feasible to secure full compliance with the objective of Canadian ownership of resource-based companies." Here's a policy which the Prime Minister set forth in June 1974, which he said again yesterday still stands, and the Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce says it hasn't been found feasible to put it into effect. Who's telling the truth? Prime Minister? The Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce. In this same document, the Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce admits that most of the investors know very little about this policy. And he says, quote, "At present, many, perhaps most foreign investors are not aware of this policy objective. There's been very little publicity, and the last statement on the subject is 3 years old." And finally, Mr. Speaker, in the same document, Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce suggests the advisability of dropping this provision. But he adds, of course, that the public shouldn't be told about it because, and again I quote, he said, "It would be preferable that there be no public statement to that effect so as to minimize the danger that the change of practice would be seen as a fallback by the government," end quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, certainly insofar as the government's commitment to maintain 50 and 60% Canadian ownership, that has proven to be a farce. It has proven that the government has not seriously attempted to carry out that policy or to maintain the level which the Prime Minister committed his government to in 1974. And I know of no better illustration of this than to take a look at the oil industry, which is the best example of creeping economic continentalism and the growing United States domination of our resource industry. In the last 50 years, the control of light oil in this country has been taken over almost entirely by United States majors. Virtually 100% of the light crude oil in this country is now under the control of American petroleum companies. The result is that they have raped this resource to the point where we have about 10 years supply left. 60% of our production of oil and natural gas for years went to the United States, even though it was well known that the amount of reserves we had on hand were perilously low. Now that we have only 10 years supply left, the industry begins to look at other sources. And the next area they looked at were the tar sands. And one might have thought that we would have learned from the light oil experience and that there would have been some public participation or some Canadian ownership in the development of the tar sands. But no. We allowed the three large American companies who formed Syncrude not only to take over the development of a large area of the tar sands, but to do so with the financial assistance of the government of Canada and the financial assistance from the governments of Ontario and Alberta. As a matter of fact, the Canadian people are putting up a major part of the money in return for a minor interest in that development. And it's interesting that the next company in line is the Shell Oil Company, another company which is going to develop the tar sands. That brings us to the present situation, Mr. Speaker, when we find that the only remaining oil acreage we have in this country, which is not completely under foreign domination, are the heavy oil deposits on the Saskatchewan-Alberta border. And these oil deposits may be very important for the future industrial development of Canada. Because at the present moment, Mr. Speaker, from the 1977 figures, we see that Canada has a net deficit in oil production of approximately 100,000 barrels a day. The result is that in 1977 we had deficit as a result of imported oil of $1.5 billion. And with our exports being phased out because of our diminishing reserves, it is estimated that by 1985 our deficit could reach $5 billion. In the light of that fact, Mr. Speaker, the heavy oil acreage in Western Canada becomes of tremendous importance. Now, that area is largely controlled by the Husky Oil Company, which has over 1.5 million acres under lease or under option. It is estimated that with the new technology now available, it has 16 billion barrels of recoverable oil. Joseph Baird, the president of Occidental Oil, is reported as having said in this morning's paper that, and I quote, is a real carrot, end quote. And it is a real carrot. 16 billion barrels of recoverable oil in a good area, reasonably accessible, not like oil in the Arctic, not like oil out in the ocean, but a supply of oil which could meet Canada's needs and save us being importers of oil and save us from increasing dependence upon the oil-producing countries who at the present time have such tremendous power around the world. Now, for over a year, Petro-Canada has been endeavoring to persuade Husky to begin a large-scale development of this heavy oil. But no action has taken place. I'm told that it even offered a partnership to help them raise the necessary capital. But that was not acceptable. As a matter of fact, I suspect that the oil industry is not averse to having Canada required to import some of its oil, particularly if they buy that oil from sources which the multinational oil companies control. Finally, Petro-Canada did what it seemed to me was the logical thing to do. It made an offer to purchase the Husky Oil Company and to develop that field either alone or in partnership with the Saskatchewan and Alberta governments. And I want to point out that they did so with the approval of the Cabinet, as the Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources has stated in the House. Now, this was a logical step to take. But what do we find? We find that whereas on Monday, June the 20th, on page 6268, the Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources thought that this development by Petro-Canada of the heavy oil deposits was in the national interest. We see that by the end of the week, the picture is beginning to change. We see it, first of all, in the Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce, who came out and criticized the decision made by Petro-Canada. And when Occidental made counter-offers to Petro-Canada's offer to buy Husky, it was the Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce who said, quote, "I'm not shedding many tears over Petro-Canada." And Alberta's Energy Minister, Don Getty, on television the other night said, "With our philosophy in the Alberta government, we don't want any publicly owned company in the field." Well, and I see it's endorsed by some of the progressive conservative members who share that view. I want to remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that the United States and Canada are probably the only two industrialized nations in the world that don't have a publicly owned oil company which controls a very major part of the oil industry in their country. And the gentleman to my right may hold back the forces of progress for a while, but the fact is the Canadian people will eventually insist that they have a voice in determining their own resources. But by last Thursday,
The Liberals are afraid.
member for Edmonton West can make all the speech he wants when I get through. He doesn't need to bust a gut shouting from his corner of the House. Matter of fact, he can't spare any of that. Now,
Learn something about the industry. There's 54 licenses you have to get your colleague to do it. That's not control.
on Thursday last at page 6432, the Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources had changed his mind. No longer a matter of the development by Petro-Canada of the Husky oil acreage being in the national interest. He then took the position that it was in the national interest that the oil deposits be developed irrespective of who developed them. That's quite a switch. He went on further to say that if it were guaranteed that Occidental would develop the field, then a Canadian objective would have been achieved. Mr. Speaker, that change of pace in 2 days is difficult to understand. First of all, it was a clear signal to FERA that there would be no objection from the Cabinet if the government decided, if FERA decided to allow the transfer of the Husky oil assets to Occidental, who was bidding against Petro-Canada. But I ask, what kind of sellout are we witnessing? Why was Petro-Canada bidding for Husky oil in the first place if it's not important that Petro-Canada develop this oil field? And if Occidental is now interested in developing that field, what has Occidental been doing up until now, when Petro-Canada and the government were trying to find some person to develop, some person or persons to develop that field? The result is that Petro-Canada has become the bird in a sort of a badminton game between two American companies who are bouncing it back and forth. Every time Petro-Canada makes a bid, Occidental tops the bid. And Mr. Speaker, I ask the House to consider what this does to the status of Petro-Canada, not only in this country but in the international petroleum business. The government's treatment of Petro-Canada in now saying that it doesn't matter who develops the field so long as it's developed demeans Petro-Canada. And the cabinet is demeaning itself by making it appear to all the world that they are manipulated by the oil cartel, which has been calling the tune up till now and apparently is still calling it. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is a very important topic because a great deposit of oil is either going to be developed by Canadians, for Canadians, or it is going to pass into the control of a foreign corporation over which we will have little control. Because if the government wasn't able to persuade Husky to develop the field with sufficient urgency, we have no guarantee that Occidental will develop the field with sufficient urgency to meet Canada's oil needs. Now, we've got two lines of defense. The first is the Foreign Ownership Review Agency, commonly known as FIRA. They have the power to recommend that there be no transfer from Husky to Occidental Petroleum Corporation, or to recommend that the transfer be permitted. Up until now, FIRA has been a comparatively toothless tiger, in my opinion. It has allowed transfer after transfer, whereas the Minister of Industry, Trade and Commerce own memo shows there was not 50% Canadian ownership. But they have a chance this time to redeem themselves. My hope is that they will be seized of the importance to Canada of applying the 50 to 60% Canadian ownership commitment and insisting that no transfer be permitted. Our second line of defense, of course, is the cabinet, because they are the ones who must make the final decision on the basis of a recommendation from FIRA.
Some defense.
And I must say I'm not overly optimistic. Certainly they haven't been very diligent in applying the 50 to 60% rule which the Prime Minister set forth in June 1974. But I do hope that public opinion in this country will be so aroused that the pressure will be brought to bear upon the Cabinet to apply the 50 to 60% ownership provision and to say that the development of the heavy oil deposits on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border are not going to be transferred to the Occidental Oil Company, but are going to be developed by the people's own firm company, Petro-Canada.
What price is the shareholder?
The price has been offered. They've been offered $52 per share, and that's what the offer is going out to them right now. And as far as Occidental is concerned, there's not an outright purchase. It's a trade, and I think many people will rather take the cash than the trade. And may I also point out that Occidental, by this morning's paper, the president of Occidental is saying that if they go ahead, they want concessions on taxes, they want concessions on royalties, and also they'd be quite willing to let the two provincial governments and Petrocan put up the major part of the money to build a tertiary recovery plant. But of course they insist on retaining the acreage and controlling the feedstock. Anybody who'd be silly enough to put up extraction facilities and leave the oil supplies in the hands of a company over which they have no control, it would certainly be buying a pig in a poke. Let me close. Well, I can't answer all the members' questions. I've only got a limited amount of time, and I'll answer any question the member wants when I sit down. Let me close by saying this, Mr. Speaker, that today we gave first reading, as I said, to a bill dealing with our Constitution. And I think what this House, and particularly the government, have to realize is that people are not made great by a Constitution. It's people who make a Constitution. And it's people who make a nation great.
The Honorable Speaker, his time has expired. You may continue with unanimous consent. Is the Honorable Member of unanimous consent? The Honorable Member for Nanaimo Couch in the office.
You start until 3:13.
He's got 30 minutes there, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order, the honourable member didn't start until 3:13. He has until 3:43.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to, I'll close. I just wanted to say this one word in closing.
Charlie, see your watch.
And that is that what makes a nation great is not just its constitution. A constitution is an attempt to put into legal form the hopes and the aspirations and the objectives of a free people. But a nation only becomes great when that nation has a sense of pride and a sense of purpose. And it can't have that, Mr. Speaker, if its resources are going to be owned outside its own borders, and if it's going to have no voice whatsoever in the determination of its own economic destiny. The Canadian historian Frank Underhill, whom many of us remember with admiration and affection, once said that a nation is a collection of people who have done great things together in the past and who are determined to do great things together in the future. The Canadian people have done great things in the past. There's a long litany of accomplishments in peace and in war of which we can be proud. Nothing would do more to galvanize the Canadian people and to make us a great nation than to have a sense of purpose with respect to developing our own resources, to do it with our own money, to do it with our own effort, and to be the arbiters of our own destiny. But to do that, Mr. Speaker, we need courageous leadership, and we need the opportunity to develop our resources. And neither the leadership nor the opportunity has been given to us by this government. And I submit, Mr. Speaker, that if the government and this House fails to deal courageously with this problem, that we and those who come after us will have to pay the price of our inertia and our apathy.